The glass doors of the Riverside Country Club reflected my stunned face as I stood outside in my rented tuxedo, watching through the window as Jessica screamed at me to leave, while 200 guests stared in shock. My son Brian stood frozen beside her, his face pale as his bride pointed her manicured finger at me, like I was some kind of intruder at the wedding I'd paid $85,000 to host. As the security guard approached me with an apologetic look, I pulled out my phone and started making calls that would bring this whole charade crashing down within the hour. I never imagined I'd be standing outside my own son's wedding. But then again, I never imagined a lot of things that happened over the past 2 years. My name is Gerald, and I'm 67 years old. I've spent my entire adult life building something from nothing. First my construction company, then my family, and finally trying to rebuild our lives after my wife Helen passed away 5 years ago. Brian was 22 when we lost his mother to cancer. I watched my strong, confident son crumble as we stood beside her hospital bed, holding her hands as she took her last breath. Helen had been the glue that held us together, the soft voice that balanced my rough edges, the one who always knew exactly what to say when Brian was struggling with something. Without her, I felt like I was trying to navigate a ship through a storm with no compass. The months after Helen's death were the darkest of our lives. Brian dropped out of his master's program, unable to focus on his studies while drowning in grief. I threw myself into work, taking on project after project, working 16-hour days, just to avoid coming home to an empty house. We were two men, sharing a space, but living in separate worlds of pain, neither of us knowing how to reach out to the other. It was my sister Martha who finally knocked sense into me. She showed up at my office one evening, shut the door behind her, and gave me the talking to of my life. "Gerald, you're losing your son," she said, her eyes fierce with determination. "Helen would be heartbroken to see you both like this. That boy needs his father, not some ghost who comes home after he's already asleep." Martha was right, as she usually was. That night, I left work early and found Brian sitting in the dark living room staring at old photo albums. We talked until sunrise, sharing memories of Helen crying together for the first time since the funeral. From that moment, I made a promise to myself and to Helen's memory that I would be the father Brian needed. I encouraged Brian to return to school, offering to pay for everything, so he could focus on his studies without worry. When he graduated with his MBA, I was the proudest father in that auditorium. My boy had fought through the worst loss imaginable and come out stronger on the other side. He landed a great job at a marketing firm downtown, and I thought we had finally found our new normal. Then 2 years ago, Brian brought Jessica home for dinner. I'll never forget that first evening. Brian was nervous, constantly adjusting his tie and checking his phone. When the doorbell rang, he practically sprinted to answer it. Jessica walked in, wearing a designer dress that probably cost more than most people's rent. Her blonde hair perfectly styled her smile bright, but somehow not quite reaching her eyes. "You must be Gerald," she said, extending her hand with the kind of practiced grace that seemed almost rehearsed. "Brian has told me so much about you." I welcomed her warmly, the way Helen would have wanted me to. I had prepared Brian's favorite meal pot roast, with all the fixings, spent the whole afternoon making sure everything was perfect. But I noticed throughout dinner that Jessica barely touched her food, pushing it around her plate, while making comments about usually eating lighter fare. Despite the awkward dinner, I was happy to see Brian so smitten. He looked at Jessica, like she hung the moon hanging on her every word, constantly reaching for her hand. If this woman made my son happy, then I would embrace her with open arms. Over the following months, Jessica became a regular fixture in our lives. She had a way of commanding attention when she entered a room, always dressed impeccably, always knowing exactly what to say in social situations. Brian seemed to transform around her, upgrading his wardrobe, talking about restaurants and wine varietals I'd never heard of, gradually adopting her more refined tastes. I told myself this was normal, that people change when they fall in love. When Brian mentioned they were getting serious, I was genuinely happy for him. Helen would have wanted him to find love again, to build a family of his own. So when they announced their engagement 6 months ago, I immediately offered to help in any way I could. "Dad, we couldn't ask you to do that," Brian had said, but I could see the relief in his eyes. "Nonsense," I told him, pulling him into a hug. "Your mother and I started saving for your wedding the day you were born. She would want you to have the wedding of your dreams." Jessica's eyes had lit up at that, the first genuine emotion I'd seen from her. "Oh, Gerald, that's incredibly generous." She gushed suddenly, much warmer toward me than she'd ever been before. I paid off Brian's student loans first, all $120,000, wanting him to start his married life without that burden. Then, I surprised them with a house in the suburbs, a beautiful 4-bedroom colonial, with a big backyard for the grandchildren I hoped would come someday. $450,000. But seeing Brian's face when I handed him the keys made every penny worth it. The wedding budget I set aside was generous by any standard. $85,000 for their special day, whatever they wanted. Jessica took charge of the planning immediately, and I was happy to let her. She seemed to have a vision, and I wanted them to have exactly the wedding they dreamed of. But something strange started happening a few months into the wedding planning. Brian began pulling away from me, canceling our weekly dinners, not returning my calls as quickly as he used to. When I asked if everything was okay, he would seem confused, saying he'd been waiting to hear from me. "Dad, I texted you 3 times this week about getting together," he said one afternoon when I stopped by his office. "Son, I never got any texts from you," I replied, pulling out my phone to show him. Brian frowned at his own phone, then shrugged. "Must be a glitch or something. Jessica's been having the same problem with her family." I should have paid more attention to that moment, should have realized that something wasn't adding up. But I trusted my son, and by extension, I tried to trust the woman he loved. It wasn't until much later that I discovered the truth about those missing messages, about the web of manipulation that had been slowly tightening around us both. Jessica had been deleting my texts and calls from Brian's phone whenever she could, telling him I was too busy with work to reach out. She'd been crafting a narrative where I was the absent father too, focused on my business to care about my son's life. Meanwhile, she was painting herself as the only one who truly understood and supported him. The discovery of her deception would come later, but the signs were there all along. The way she would whisper to Brian whenever I made a suggestion, the subtle eye rolls when I told stories about the construction business, the barely concealed disdain when I showed up to family dinners in my work clothes, because I'd come straight from a job site. But I loved my son, and I wanted to believe that the distance growing between us was just wedding stress, that once they settled into married life, things would go back to normal. I kept telling myself that Jessica would warm up to me eventually, that she just needed time to feel secure in the family. How wrong I was. How completely devastatingly wrong. 6 months before the wedding, I decided to host an engagement party at my home. It was the house Helen and I had built together 30 years ago, where Brian had grown up, where every corner held memories of our life as a family. I spent weeks preparing, had the whole place professionally cleaned, hired caterers, even had the garden landscaped to look perfect for the occasion. The morning of the party, I stood in the backyard watching the rental company set up tables and chairs, feeling Helen's presence strongly. She would have loved this, would have been fussing over every detail, making sure everything was just right for our boy. I was trying to honor her memory by giving Brian and Jessica the celebration she would have wanted them to have. Guests started arriving around 2 in the afternoon. My sister Martha came early to help, bringing her famous 7-layer dip, and enough enthusiasm to power a small city. My construction crew showed up in their Sunday best, looking uncomfortable in dress shirts, but wanting to support Brian, who they'd watched grow up around the job sites. Helen's book club ladies came with armfuls of flowers and misty eyes, hugging me and telling me how proud Helen would be. Brian arrived looking handsome in a navy suit, his face glowing with happiness. He hugged me tightly, thanking me again for everything. For a moment, it felt like old times, just my boy and me, no distance or awkwardness between us. Then Jessica's silver Mercedes pulled up, and the atmosphere shifted. She stepped out in a dress that looked like it belonged on a runway, not in a backyard in suburban Kansas City. Her parents followed Robert and Patricia Hawthorne, both dressed like they were attending a country club gala, rather than a family gathering. Jessica's sister Brittany emerged last, typing on her phone and looking bored before she'd even entered the yard. Gerald. Jessica said, air-kissing me on both cheeks, a gesture that felt as foreign as a handshake from my own son. The place looks quaint. Quaint. That's how she described the home where I'd raised my family, where Helen had planted roses along the fence, where Brian had taken his first steps on the back porch. As the party progressed, Jessica's discomfort became increasingly obvious. When Martha tried to engage her in conversation about the wedding plans, Jessica responded with short, dismissive answers. When the guys from my crew congratulated Brian and tried to include Jessica in their good-natured ribbing, she stood there with a frozen smile, clearly counting the seconds until she could escape. The moment that changed everything came about 2 hours into the party. I was standing by the grill talking with Tom Bradley, my lawyer, and one of my oldest friends when I heard Jessica's voice carrying across the yard. "Can you believe this place?" she was saying to her mother. "It's like a time capsule. That kitchen hasn't been updated since the 80s. And did you see the bathroom? I don't know how Brian survived growing up here." Patricia Hawthorne's response was equally cutting. "Well, darling, not everyone has your refined taste. Some people are perfectly content living in simplicity." They both laughed, a tinkling, cruel sound that made my stomach turn. This was my Helen's house. They were mocking the home we'd built with our own hands, where we'd raised our son with love and hard work. Martha, who had overheard the same conversation, marched over to them with fire in her eyes. "Excuse me," she said, her voice deceptively calm. "I couldn't help but overhear your comments about my brother's home. This house was built with more love than you'll find in any mansion. Every room tells a story of a family that worked hard for everything they have." Jessica's face flushed, but she quickly recovered. "Oh, Martha, I didn't mean anything by it. I was just observing how different Brian's childhood was from mine." "Yes, I imagine it was quite different," Martha shot back. "Brian grew up learning the value of hard work and family. Some lessons can't be taught in private schools." The tension was thick enough to cut, but what happened next shocked me even more. Jessica turned to Brian, whispered something in his ear, and suddenly my son was asking his aunt to leave. "Aunt Martha, I think it's best if you go," Brian said, not meeting anyone's eyes. "We don't need this kind of drama at our engagement party." Martha looked as stunned as I felt. She'd been like a second mother to Brian after Helen died, and here he was, dismissing her like she was some party crasher. She gathered her dignity, hugged me goodbye, and left without another word. But I could see the hurt in her eyes. As Martha's car pulled away, I noticed Robert and Patricia Hawthorne exchanging satisfied looks. Robert raised his champagne glass slightly toward his wife, a subtle toast to their daughter's successful manipulation. The rest of the party passed in a blur. I went through the motions playing the happy host, but my mind was reeling. Who was this woman my son was marrying? And more importantly, who was my son becoming under her influence? As the evening wore on and the guests began to leave, I found myself alone in the kitchen, loading the dishwasher and trying to make sense of what had happened. The caterers had gone. Brian and Jessica were in the living room with her family, and I could hear their laughter drifting in through the doorway. That's when I heard Jessica on the phone. She must have stepped out onto the back porch, not realizing the kitchen window was open. "No, it's perfect," she was saying. "The old man has no idea. Brian's completely under my thumb now. Did you see how quickly he got rid of his aunt when I asked? By the time we're married, I'll have complete control over everything." There was a pause as she listened to whoever was on the other end. "Of course I'm sure about the inheritance," she continued. "Gerald's worth at least $8 million between the construction company and his properties. Brian's the only heir. Once we're married, all of that becomes community property. We just need to handle the old man once everything's legal. My blood ran cold. Handle the old man. Is that what I was to her? An obstacle to be handled? Trust me. Jessica went on, another year or two, and we'll convince Brian that Gerald needs to be in a home. He's already starting to believe his father is becoming distant and difficult. By the time I'm done, Brian will think it was his own idea. Then, we'll have power of attorney control of the business everything. I gripped the edge of the counter, my mind racing. This wasn't just about a snobbish daughter-in-law who looked down on my blue-collar background. This was a calculated plan to separate me from my son and steal everything Helen and I had built. Jessica ended her call and came back inside, stopping short when she saw me in the kitchen. "Oh, Gerald," she said, her fake smile sliding into place. "I didn't realize you were in here. Let me help with those dishes." "No need," I managed to say, my voice remarkably steady, considering the turmoil inside me. "Why don't you get back to Brian? I'm sure he's wondering where you are." She studied me for a moment, perhaps wondering if I'd overheard anything, then shrugged and returned to the living room. I watched her go, seeing her now for what she truly was, a predator who had identified my son as prey. But I wasn't some naive old man who would roll over and let her destroy my family. I'd built my business from nothing, survived losing the love of my life, and raised a good son despite my own shortcomings. If Jessica Hawthorne thought she could waltz in and tear down everything I'd created, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. That night, after everyone had gone home and I was alone in my empty house, I made a decision. I wouldn't confront Brian directly, not yet. He was too deep under Jessica's spell to see the truth. Instead, I would do what I'd always done in business. When faced with a challenge, gather information, plan carefully, and wait for the right moment to act. I called Tom Bradley the next morning. "Tom, I need you to do something for me," I said without preamble when he answered. "I need you to look into Jessica Hawthorne. Everything. Financial history, family background, previous relationships, everything you can find." There was a pause on the other end. "Gerald, are you sure about this? Investigating your future daughter-in-law?" "I overheard something last night," I interrupted. "Something that makes me think my son is in danger. Not physical danger, but financial and emotional manipulation. I need to know what we're dealing with." Tom sighed. "All right, old friend. I'll see what I can find. But Gerald, be careful. If Brian finds out you're investigating Jessica—" "He won't," I assured him. "I know how to be discreet. Just get me the information, and I'll figure out what to do with it." As I hung up the phone, I looked at the photo of Helen on my desk. "I'm going to protect our boy," I promised her. "Whatever it takes." Little did I know that what Tom would uncover would be worse than anything I had imagined, and that the fight to save my son would test every bit of strength and cunning I possessed. The weeks following the engagement party marked the beginning of Jessica's systematic campaign to isolate Brian from everyone who loved him. I watched it happen, with growing alarm, each incident more brazen than the last, yet executed with such cunning that Brian remained oblivious to the manipulation. Jessica took complete control of the wedding planning, which at first seemed reasonable enough. Most brides want to handle the details of their special day, but her methods were anything but normal. She scheduled every vendor meeting during my work hours, always calling Brian at the last minute to say the only available slot was when she knew I'd be at a job site. "Dad, Jessica says the florist can only meet us at 2 this afternoon," Brian would call to tell me. "I know you're pouring foundation at the Morrison project today." "It's fine, son," I'd reply, swallowing my disappointment. "You two make the decisions. It's your day." But it wasn't fine. Each missed meeting was another brick in the wall Jessica was building between us. When I'd ask about the plans later, Jessica would sigh dramatically and say, "Oh, Gerald, we really could have used your input. Such a shame you couldn't make it." The guest list became another battlefield. I'd given them a list of 50 people from my side family, close friends, and the key employees who had helped build my business, and watched Brian grow up. When I received the first draft of the invitations, only 15 of my people were included. "Jessica, what happened to the rest of my list?" I asked during one of our rare family dinners. She didn't even look up from her phone. "Oh, we had to make some cuts. The venue can only hold so many people and my family is quite large. Besides, Brian agreed that we wanted a more sophisticated crowd." I looked at my son who was pushing food around his plate. "Brian, you don't want Sam and Eddie there. They taught you how to use power tools when you were 10. "Dad, it's just—" Brian started, then glanced at Jessica. "We're trying to keep things elegant. Having a bunch of construction workers there might make Jessica's family uncomfortable." The words hit me like a physical blow. Those construction workers had been more like uncles to Brian than employees. They'd come to his baseball games, celebrated his graduations, been pallbearers at Helen's funeral. Now, they weren't good enough for his wedding. "Those men helped put you through college," I said quietly. "Their labor paid for the very education that got you where you are today." Jessica's phone suddenly rang conveniently, ending the conversation. But the damage was done. Another piece of the real Brian chipped away, replaced by this stranger who valued appearances over loyalty. The financial manipulation started subtly. Jessica had insisted on having access to the wedding credit card I'd provided, which made sense for planning purposes. The initial charges were expected venue deposit, catering, tastings, dress appointments. But then, I started noticing other charges that raised eyebrows. $15,000 for wedding party accommodations caught my attention first. When I inquired, Jessica explained sweetly that her family was coming from Connecticut and couldn't afford hotels. It would mean so much to have them close by during the wedding weekend. She said, batting her eyelashes at Brian, who immediately agreed it was the least we could do. Then came $8,000 for bridesmaid dresses. "They need to match perfectly," Jessica explained. "And my cousins are in college. We can't expect them to pay these prices." $3,000 for a spa weekend showed up next. "Mother-daughter bonding before the wedding," Jessica said. "It's tradition in our family." I watched the charges mount, documenting everything, but saying nothing. Each expense came with a perfectly reasonable explanation, delivered with Jessica's practiced smile and Brian's eager agreement. The boy who used to help me review construction bids, who understood the value of a dollar, now signed off on any expense Jessica suggested without question. Meanwhile, Jessica's isolation tactics grew bolder. She began planning pre-wedding events that somehow always conflicted with my time with Brian. When I had tickets to a Royals game for Brian's birthday, a tradition since he was 5, Jessica suddenly had a crucial cake tasting appointment that couldn't be rescheduled. When I invited them to Sunday dinner, Jessica remembered a wedding shower thrown by her sorority sisters that Brian simply had to attend. "Dad, I'm sorry," Brian would say, sounding genuinely conflicted. "You know I'd rather go to the game, but Jessica's really stressed about the wedding. I need to support her." The pattern became clear. Jessica would create a conflict, frame it as a test of Brian's loyalty, and my son would choose her every time. Each choice drove the wedge deeper between us. One evening, about 3 months before the wedding, I decided to visit Brian at his office. I brought sandwiches from his favorite deli, hoping for some father-son time without Jessica's interference. I found him at his desk, looking exhausted. "Rough day?" I asked, setting the food down. He rubbed his eyes. "Jessica's been really anxious about the wedding. She calls me constantly during work to go over details. My boss is starting to notice. Maybe she should handle some of this with her mother instead," I suggested carefully. "You need to focus on your career." Brian's expression hardened. "Jessica says you'd say something like that. That you don't understand how important this is to her, to us." "Son, I'm just concerned." "Dad, Jessica thinks." He paused, seeming to wrestle with something. "She thinks you don't really support our marriage. That you're trying to sabotage things by not being involved in the planning." The accusation was so backwards from reality that I couldn't speak for a moment. I'd offered repeatedly to help, only to be scheduled out of every opportunity. I'd written checks without complaint, welcomed Jessica, despite my growing concerns, tried everything to be supportive. "Brian, that's not true. I've tried to be involved." "Then why do you always have excuses for missing meetings?" he shot back. "Why do you complain about the guest list instead of trusting our judgment? Jessica's really hurt by your attitude." I realized then how completely Jessica had rewritten reality for him. Every manipulation had been reversed in the telling, making me the villain in their story. The psychological grip she had on my son was complete. That night, I met Tom Bradley at a quiet bar downtown. He'd been investigating Jessica for weeks, and the look on his face told me he'd found something significant. "Gerald, you were right to be concerned." He began sliding a folder across the table. "Jessica Hawthorne isn't who she claims to be." I opened the folder, my hands trembling slightly. Inside were court documents, financial records, and photographs that painted a very different picture from the sophisticated Connecticut blue blood Jessica pretended to be. "She was married before," Tom explained. 3 years ago to a guy named Marcus Pemberton, trust fund kid from Philadelphia. The marriage lasted 18 months, and the divorce was messy. I studied the divorce papers. Jessica had taken Marcus for half his trust fund, claiming emotional abuse, and demanding alimony despite the short marriage. The most disturbing part was a statement from Marcus's sister, claiming Jessica had systematically isolated him from his family, convinced him to give her access to his accounts, then cleaned him out before filing for divorce. "It gets worse," Tom continued. "The Hawthorne family, they're broke. Robert Hawthorne's investment firm collapsed 2 years ago. They're facing bankruptcy, multiple lawsuits. That house in Connecticut, Jessica always talks about, in foreclosure. They've been living off credit cards and borrowed money, probably counting on your son's marriage to Jessica to save them." Everything clicked into place. The rush to get married, the expensive tastes, the isolation tactics. This wasn't Jessica's first time running this con. She was a professional predator, and my son was her latest mark. "There's one more thing," Tom said, his expression grim. "I had my investigator follow up on some of Jessica's recent activities. She's been in contact with her ex-husband, frequently. Whatever ended their marriage, they seem to be on very good terms now." I felt sick. My poor boy had no idea what he'd gotten himself into. But how could I make him see the truth when Jessica had done such a masterful job of turning him against me? "What do I do, Tom?" I asked, feeling every one of my 67 years. "Build your case carefully," he advised. "Document everything. Record conversations if you can, legally, of course. And Gerald, protect your assets. If she's planning what I think she's planning, you need to make sure she can't touch your money or your business no matter what happens with Brian." I left that meeting with a heavy heart, but a clear purpose. Jessica Hawthorne had made a critical mistake. She'd assumed I was just some simple construction worker who'd gotten lucky, too naive to see through her schemes. She was about to learn that building a successful business from nothing required more than just hard work. It required strategy, patience, and the ability to see problems coming before they crushed you. The war for my son's future had begun, and I intended to win. The rehearsal dinner was held at the Fairmont Hotel downtown, in their most elegant ballroom. I'd paid $12,000 for the evening, wanting everything perfect for Brian and Jessica, despite my growing concerns. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was financing my own humiliation, but I held on to hope that maybe somehow the evening would bring our family together. I arrived early, wearing the new suit Martha had helped me pick out. "You clean up nice, big brother," she'd said, adjusting my tie. After the engagement party incident, I'd privately apologized to her and shared some of my concerns about Jessica. Martha, fierce as always, had insisted on attending the dinner as my +1. "Someone needs to have your back," she'd said. The ballroom was stunning, all crystal chandeliers and white roses. Jessica had spared no expense with my money. Round tables draped in silk, gold-rimmed china, a string quartet playing softly in the corner. It looked like something out of a magazine, beautiful, but somehow cold, lacking the warmth that Helen would have brought to our son's celebration. Guests began arriving, and I noticed immediately how the room divided itself. Jessica's family and friends clustered on one side, all air kisses and designer clothes, while my people gathered on the other, looking slightly uncomfortable in the opulent setting. Even Sam and Eddie, the two construction workers who'd made the severely cut guest list, stood near the bar, like they were afraid to touch anything. Gerald. Robert Hawthorne's voice boomed across the room. Jessica's father approached with his politician's smile, hand extended. The man of the hour. Well, the man paying for the hour anyway. He laughed at his own joke, the sound grating on my nerves. Robert, I acknowledged, shaking his hand briefly. Quite a spread you've put on here. He continued gesturing around the room. Must be nice having all that construction money to throw around. Though I suppose it's blue-collar money well spent getting your boy into our family. The condescension dripped from every word. This man whose business had failed, who was secretly bankrupt, had the audacity to look down on money earned through honest work. I bit my tongue, remembering Tom's advice to document everything to let them reveal themselves. I'm just happy to see Brian happy, I managed to say. Yes, well, Jessica has that effect on men, Robert smirked. She knows how to elevate them. Your son's lucky she saw potential in him despite his background. Before I could respond, the wedding party arrived. Brian looked handsome, but tired stress, evident in the lines around his eyes. Jessica swept in like royalty, wearing a white dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, her bridesmaids flanking her like ladies-in-waiting. Gerald. She acknowledged me coolly, then immediately turned to her father. Daddy, is everything set for your speech? All ready, Princess, Robert assured her. It's going to be memorable. Something in the way they exchanged glances made my stomach tighten. I found my assigned seat, notably at a table far from the wedding party, surrounded by Jessica's elderly relatives, who spent the entire dinner discussing their stock portfolios and vacation homes. The meal was exquisite, but I barely tasted it. I watched Brian at the head table, saw how Jessica would touch his arm whenever he started to look my way, drawing his attention back to her circle. My son looked like a stranger in his expensive suit, laughing at jokes I couldn't hear existing in a world that seemed specifically designed to exclude me. When the speeches began, Jessica's maid of honor went first, gushing about Jessica's impeccable taste and how she always got what she wanted. When Jessica told me she was dating a guy from Kansas City, I was like, girl, really? But then she explained her plan. I mean, she explained how special Brian was, and I knew she'd found her prince. The slip was subtle but telling. Her plan. Not their love story, but her plan. Then, Robert Hawthorne stood tapping his champagne glass for attention. The room fell silent as he moved to the microphone, his smile wide and predatory. Good evening, everyone. I'm honored to speak tonight about the union of my daughter Jessica and young Brian here. He paused, letting his gaze drift to me. You know, when Jessica first brought Brian home, I'll admit I had my doubts. Kansas City construction money. It wasn't exactly what we'd envisioned for our princess. Nervous laughter rippled through Jessica's side of the room. My people shifted uncomfortably. But then, I met Gerald. Robert continued, his tone dripping with false warmth. A simple man who worked with his hands, salt of the earth type. The kind of guy who probably never imagined his son would marry into a family like ours. Martha grabbed my hand under the table, squeezing hard to keep me in my seat. But that's the American dream, isn't it? Robert went on. A man can swing hammers, pour concrete, do all that manual labor. And if he works hard enough, saves his pennies, he can give his son opportunities he never had. Like the opportunity to marry my Jessica. And Gerald has been so generous. He emphasized the word, like it was amusing. Writing checks left and right, almost like he's trying to buy his way into our world. But money can't buy class, can it? Still, we appreciate the effort. I heard Sam mutter a curse under his breath from 2 tables over. Eddie looked ready to stand up and deck Robert Hawthorne. But I remained frozen, watching my son's face. Brian sat there not defending me, not even looking uncomfortable. He just smiled and nodded like this public humiliation of his father was perfectly acceptable. But here's what matters. Robert raised his glass. Jessica saw something in Brian, some potential hidden beneath that rough exterior. And with her guidance, her influence, he's already becoming more refined. Give it a few years, and you might not even recognize the boy from Kansas anymore. To Jessica, for having the vision to mold this young man into someone worthy of her, the toast was met with enthusiastic applause from Jessica's crowd. My people sat in stunned silence. I looked at Brian, willing him to say something to show some spark of the boy I'd raised. But he just raised his glass and drank Jessica's hand possessively on his arm. When dinner ended and people began mingling, I stepped out onto the hotel's terrace for air. The Kansas City skyline stretched before me, buildings I'd helped construct dotting the horizon. I'd built so much in my life, but I couldn't seem to hold on to the one thing that mattered most. "Dad?" I turned to find Brian standing in the doorway looking uncertain. "That was a nice dinner, son," I said, not trusting myself to say more. "About Robert's speech." Brian began, then stopped. "Jessica says he has a different sense of humor. More sophisticated. He didn't mean anything by it." "Didn't he?" I asked quietly. Brian's jaw tightened. "See, this is what Jessica means. You always take things personally. Not everything is an attack on you, Dad. Your future father-in-law just spent 5 minutes telling a room full of people that I'm not good enough, that my money's dirty, that you need to be molded into something better than what I raised. And you sat there smiling." He was joking. Was he? Tell me, Brian, when did you become ashamed of where you came from? When did the men who helped raise you become too blue-collar for your wedding? Brian's face flushed. "I'm not ashamed. I'm just growing, evolving. Jessica's helped me see that there's more to life than baseball games and construction sites. And what about family? Is there more to life than that too?" Before Brian could answer, Jessica appeared in the doorway. "There you are, sweetie. We need you for photos." She looked at me with cold eyes. "Gerald." "Actually, Jessica, I need to talk to you both about something," I said, making a sudden decision. "Can it wait?" she asked impatiently. "We have a schedule to keep." "No, it can't." I pulled out my phone, finding the email Tom had sent me. "I recently learned something interesting. Jessica, why didn't you mention you were married before?" The color drained from her face. Brian looked confused. "Married, Jessica." "It wasn't important," Jessica said quickly. "It was annulled. Basically didn't count." 18 months is a long time for something that didn't count, I pressed. "And Marcus Pemberton seems to think it counted, especially the part where you took half his trust fund." "How dare you investigate me?" Jessica snarled, dropping her sweet facade entirely. "Dad, what the hell?" Brian looked shocked. "You've been spying on Jessica." "I've been protecting you," I corrected. "Someone has to, since you won't protect yourself." "This is exactly what I told you he'd do," Jessica said to Brian, tears suddenly appearing in her eyes. "He's trying to break us up because he can't stand losing control of you. First the guilt trips, now this character assassination." "Son, her family is bankrupt. They're counting on your money." "Enough," Brian shouted. "Dad, I can't believe you'd stoop this low. Jessica told me you might try something to ruin our wedding, but I defended you. I said you'd never do that. But here you are, making up lies." "They're not lies. I have the documents." "I don't want to see them." Brian wrapped his arm around Jessica. "You need to leave, now." "Brian, please just listen." "Go, Dad. And maybe you shouldn't come tomorrow if you can't be supportive." The words hit like a sledgehammer. My own son choosing a woman he'd known for 2 years, over the father who'd raised him, loved him, sacrificed everything for him. Jessica's tears had miraculously dried. She looked at me with triumph in her eyes. "You heard him, Gerald. This is a family celebration, and clearly you're not family anymore." I left the hotel in a daze, Martha driving because my hands were shaking too badly. We sat in my driveway for 20 minutes, neither of us speaking. Finally, Martha broke the silence. "She's good," my sister said grimly. "Really good. She turned that whole thing around on you." "What do I do now?" I asked, feeling lost. "He's my son, Martha. My boy." "You show up tomorrow," she said firmly. "You put on your suit, you hold your head high, and you go to your son's wedding. Because you're his father, and that's what fathers do. And if that witch tries to stop you, she'll have to go through me first." But even Martha's fierce loyalty couldn't prepare us for what would happen the next day. Jessica had won this battle, but the war wasn't over. She'd made one crucial mistake in her victory. She'd pushed too hard, shown her true face for just a moment. And I'd been recording the entire conversation on my phone. The morning of my son's wedding dawned bright and clear, one of those perfect June days that seemed to mock the turmoil in my heart. I'd barely slept, replaying the rehearsal dinner confrontation over and over. Despite Brian's words, I put on my tuxedo with shaking hands. Martha was right. Fathers show up for their sons no matter what. I arrived at the Riverside Country Club 3 hours before the ceremony, hoping to help with setup and maybe find a quiet moment with Brian. The venue was magnificent. $85,000 of my money transformed into a wonderland of white roses, twinkling lights, and elegant drapery. Workers bustled about, adding final touches to centerpieces and adjusting the archway where my son would promise his life to a woman who was systematically destroying our family. I found Jessica's family already there, treating the venue like their personal playground. Patricia Hawthorne was barking orders at the staff, demanding changes to arrangements that had been finalized weeks ago. "No, no, no. The Pemberton Smythe family cannot be seated near the kitchen doors. Move them immediately." Her sister Brittany lounged on a settee, getting her makeup done while complaining loudly about the Missouri humidity ruining her hair. Robert Hawthorne held court at the bar, already drinking, despite the early hour regaling Jessica's cousins with stories about his glory days in finance. None of them acknowledged my presence. I made my way to the preparation area, hoping to find Brian. Instead, I encountered 2 of Jessica's bridesmaids guarding the hallway like sentries. "I'm looking for my son," I said simply. "Jessica's orders," one of them replied with a smirk. "No one sees the groom before she approves it. Bad luck or whatever." "I'm his father. And she's going to be his wife. Guess which one matters more now?" I turned away, anger simmering beneath my carefully controlled exterior. In the main ballroom, I watched Patricia adding charges to my tab, upgrading the champagne, adding extra flowers, treating my money like an endless fountain. Each signature on those receipts felt like another slap in the face. An hour before the ceremony, I was adjusting my boutonniere in the men's room when Robert Hawthorne walked in. He smiled when he saw me, the predatory expression I'd come to recognize. "Gerald, good to see you made it. After last night, we weren't sure you'd show." "It's my son's wedding," I replied evenly. "Yes, about that." Robert moved closer, lowering his voice. "Jessica's concerned about your behavior. These wild accusations, the attempt to sabotage their happiness. It's really quite pathetic." "The only thing pathetic here is a bankrupt man pretending to have class while living off my money." I shot back, tired of playing nice. Robert's face darkened. "Careful, Gerald. After today, Brian will be part of our family. Jessica knows how to handle difficult in-laws. Just ask Marcus Pemberton's parents. Haven't seen their son in 2 years. The threat was clear. Play along or lose Brian forever. Now," Robert continued, smoothing his expression back into false friendliness, "Jessica has a small request. Given your volatility lately, she thinks it's best if you sit in the back during the ceremony. And definitely no speeches at the reception. We wouldn't want another scene like last night." "You want me to be invisible at my own son's wedding?" "I want you to know your place," he replied coldly. "You've had Brian for 30 years. It's Jessica's turn now. Accept it gracefully or don't. But either way, your time is over." He left me standing there, fists clenched, fighting every instinct that told me to knock his teeth out. But that's what they wanted, wasn't it? For me to lose control, to become the violent, unstable blue-collar stereotype they'd painted me as. 45 minutes before the ceremony, I finally found a moment alone in the garden, trying to center myself. That's when Jessica appeared, a vision in white that belied the darkness in her heart. She was alone, her bridesmaids nowhere in sight. "Gerald," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "We need to talk." I pulled out my phone, discreetly starting the recording app. "What about Jessica?" She moved closer, her expression shifting from sweet to savage in an instant. "About your pathetic attempts to stop this wedding. Did you really think showing Brian some papers would change anything? I've spent 2 years turning him against you. He believes whatever I tell him now." "Why?" I asked simply. "Why destroy a family?" "Destroy." She laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "I'm upgrading. Do you have any idea what it's been like pretending to care about your boring stories, your pathetic house, your working-class values? But it's almost over now. Once we're married, I'll have access to everything. Brian's already agreed to add me to all his accounts to make me beneficiary of his trust fund." "The trust fund I created for him?" I reminded her. "Yes, your money," she sneered. "Made from pouring concrete and hammering nails. Do you know what real wealth looks like, Gerald? It's not calloused hands and pickup trucks. It's civilization, refinement, culture. Things you could never understand." "Your family is bankrupt," I stated flatly. "You're hardly in a position to lecture about wealth." Her face twisted with rage. "Temporary setbacks. But with Brian's inheritance, we'll be back where we belong. And you'll be in some nursing home where you belong, drooling into your pudding, while I redecorate that pathetic house of yours. Brian would never. Brian will do exactly what I tell him." She cut me off. "Haven't you figured that out yet? He chose me over you last night. He'll choose me every time. Because I've made him dependent on me, convinced him that I'm the only one who truly understands him." She stepped even closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "And here's the best part, Gerald. Even if you played him this recording, he wouldn't believe it. I'd cry, say you manipulated the audio, that you're so desperate to break us up, you'd fake evidence. And he'd believe me. Because that's what love does. It makes people stupid." "You don't love him," I said, disgust evident in my voice. "Love." She laughed again. "Love is for poor people who can't afford better motivations. I'm 32, Gerald. My first husband wised up too quickly, but Brian's perfect. Malleable, trusting, and rich. Or he will be once you're out of the picture. I'll never be out of Brian's life." "You already are," she smirked. "You just haven't accepted it yet. But you will. Today, in fact. Because you're going to sit in that back row like the nobody you are, and you're going to watch your son pledge his life to me. And then you're going to disappear. Quietly. Or I'll make Brian's life so miserable he'll hate you for causing it." She started to turn away, then paused. "Oh, and Gerald, that recording you're making. Go ahead and keep it. Consider it a souvenir of the day you lost your son." With that, she glided away, leaving me standing in the garden with rage and determination warring in my chest. She'd been so confident, so assured of her victory, that she'd revealed everything. The mask had finally slipped completely. I looked at my phone, checking that the recording had captured everything. Then, I made a series of quick calls. "Tom, it's Gerald. I need you at the country club immediately. Bring the files. Yes, all of them. Martha, get Sam and Eddie. Tell them to come in their work clothes. I'll explain when you get here. First National Bank. This is Gerald Morrison. I need to put an immediate stop payment on a check. Yes, the $85,000. Fraudulent circumstances." As I made call after call, I felt a strange calm settling over me. Jessica thought she'd won, that I was just some stupid old construction worker she could manipulate and discard. She was about to learn that the skills that built my business, strategic thinking, careful planning, and the ability to demolish unstable structures, applied to more than just buildings. 20 minutes before the ceremony, chaos erupted. The venue coordinator came running to find Patricia Hawthorne, panic in her eyes. "Ma'am, we've just been notified that the payment has been canceled. The bank says suspected fraud. We need immediate payment or—" "That's impossible," Patricia screeched. "Gerald paid months ago." "Yes, ma'am, but he's apparently withdrawn that payment. Without immediate resolution, I'm afraid we'll have to cancel the event." Jessica appeared, her face white with rage beneath her veil. She spotted me across the room and stormed over her designer dress, swishing furiously. "What have you done?" she hissed. "Protecting my son," I replied calmly, "and giving him one last chance to see the truth." "You can't do this. The guests are arriving. Fix this immediately." "No." That single word seemed to break something in her. She raised her voice, not caring who heard. "You stupid, pathetic old man. You think this will stop me? Brian will hate you forever for ruining our wedding." "Maybe," I acknowledged. "But at least he'll be free of you." What happened next occurred so fast, I barely had time to react. Jessica screamed, lunging at me with her manicured nails aimed at my face. I stepped back, raising my hands defensively, as her bridesmaids rushed to restrain her. "You're not welcome here," she shrieked. "Security, get this man out. He's destroying everything. Go away, Gerald. Go away." As security approached, looking apologetic, but determined, I saw Brian pushing through the crowd that had gathered. His face was a mix of confusion and horror, as he took in the scene, his bride screaming like a banshee, the venue staff in panic, guests murmuring in shock. "Dad, Jessica, what's going on?" "Your father canceled all the payments," Jessica cried, switching instantly back to victim mode. "He's trying to destroy our wedding because he can't stand to lose you." Brian looked at me, and for a moment I saw a flicker of the boy I'd raised, confused and hurt beneath the designer suit. "Dad, is this true?" "Every word," I confirmed. "And I have something you need to hear." As security reached me, I pulled out my phone one last time. "You can throw me out, son. But first listen to this. Just listen. You owe me that much." The security guards paused, looking between Brian and me uncertainly. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as I hit play on the recording of Jessica's confession in the garden. Her voice filled the space, clear and damning. "I've spent 2 years turning him against you. He believes whatever I tell him now." As the recording played, I watched the color drain from Jessica's face and the confusion deepen in Brian's eyes. But I didn't stay to see the rest. I had one more card to play, and timing was everything. "Throw me out if you want," I said to security. "I'm leaving anyway. But Tom Bradley's in the parking lot with some documents Brian needs to see. The truth about his fiance's first marriage, her family's bankruptcy, and her plans for his inheritance." I walked out of my son's wedding with my head high, leaving chaos in my wake. Behind me, I could hear Jessica's increasingly desperate attempts to explain away the recording, Patricia Hawthorne's shrill demands for payment, and Robert's blustering threats of lawsuits. But most importantly, I heard Brian's voice, small and uncertain. "Jessica, what did you mean about turning me against my father?" The wedding that I'd paid $85,000 for was about to implode. And despite the pain of the moment, I knew I'd done the right thing. Sometimes, love means letting someone fall, but making sure you're there to catch them when they finally see the truth. As I reached my truck in the parking lot, I found Tom Bradley waiting with a briefcase full of evidence, Martha standing fierce beside him with Sam, and Eddie flanking her like bodyguards. My real family, the one built on loyalty and honest work, rather than manipulation and greed. "Ready for phase 2? Tom asked. I nodded, looking back at the country club where my son's life was either ending or beginning, depending on what he chose to do with the truth. "Let's go save my boy," I said. The explosion was just beginning. The next 30 minutes unfolded like a carefully controlled demolition. From the parking lot, I watched through the floor-to-ceiling windows as the Hawthorne house of cards came tumbling down in spectacular fashion. Tom Bradley stood beside me with his briefcase of evidence, while Martha coordinated with the staff inside through text messages, having befriended several servers during the setup, who were more than happy to provide real-time updates on the unfolding drama. Inside the venue, pandemonium reigned. The wedding coordinator had given the wedding party 30 minutes to produce payment or vacate the premises. Patricia Hawthorne was frantically calling credit card companies, each declining her maxed-out cards. Robert had sobered up quickly when faced with the reality that his free ride was over and was now cornering anyone who would listen, trying to negotiate payment plans. But the real drama centered on Brian and Jessica. Through the windows, I could see them in heated discussion near the altar, Jessica gesturing wildly, while Brian stood with his head in his hands. The recording had shaken him, but Jessica was a master manipulator. Even now, she was probably spinning tales of context and misunderstanding. That's when Tom made his entrance. My lawyer friend walked into the venue with the confidence of a man holding a royal flush. He approached Brian directly, ignoring Jessica's attempts to intercept him. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I could see Tom presenting document after document to my son. The divorce papers from Jessica's first marriage. Bank statements showing the Hawthorne family's crushing debt. Text messages between Jessica and her ex-husband discussing their next mark. The moment Brian's face changed, I knew he was beginning to see the truth. He held up one particular document, pointing at something, his expression shifting from confusion to dawning horror. Jessica tried to grab the papers, but Brian stepped back, keeping them out of her reach. Then, my son looked up, scanning the room until his eyes found mine through the window. The pain I saw there nearly broke my heart, but there was something else too. Clarity. For the first time in 2 years, my boy was seeing clearly. I nodded to him once, then gestured to Tom. It was time for the final revelation. Tom pulled out his phone and showed Brian something on the screen. Later, I learned it was a series of text messages between Jessica and her mother, planning every step of the manipulation, discussing how to best isolate Brian from me, celebrating each successful attempt to drive a wedge between us. The messages were damning, showing premeditation and malice that even Jessica couldn't explain away. Brian's face crumbled. He said something to Tom, who pointed toward the parking lot. My son started walking toward the exit, Jessica clutching at his arm, but he shook her off with a firmness I hadn't seen in years. The guests were in full gossip mode, now phones out, recording everything. Jessica's carefully curated image was being destroyed in real-time broadcast to social media for the world to see. Several of her bridesmaids had already fled, not wanting to be associated with the scandal. As Brian pushed through the doors into the parking lot, Jessica made one last desperate play. She ran after him, tears streaming down her face, her wedding dress billowing as she threw herself at his feet in the parking lot. "Brian, please," she sobbed. "I love you. Everything I did was because I love you. Your father is twisting everything, making it sound horrible, when all I wanted was to protect you from his influence." My son stopped, looking down at her with an expression I'd never seen before. Cold, distant. The scales had finally fallen from his eyes. "Protect me," Brian's voice carried across the parking lot. "You isolated me from my father. You made me believe he didn't care about me. You were planning to put him in a nursing home and steal everything he built. How is that protecting me?" "I was protecting us," Jessica cried. "From his working-class mentality, from being held back by his limitations, we deserve better." "No," Brian said quietly. "You thought you deserved his money. There's a difference." He turned and walked toward me, leaving Jessica kneeling in the parking lot in her wedding dress. When he reached me, my son looked broken but determined. "Dad," he said, his voice cracking, "I'm so sorry. I don't know how I let this happen. How I let her." I pulled him into a hug, the first real embrace we'd shared in months. "It's not your fault, son. She's a professional. She's done this before." "The private investigator found 3 other cases," Tom added quietly. "All the same pattern. Jessica targets men with family money, isolates them, marries them, then divorces them once she has access to the assets. Your father saved you from becoming victim number 4. Brian pulled back from the hug, wiping his eyes. What do I do now? The guests? The venue? Everything? We handle it, I said firmly. First things first. Tom. Tom stepped forward with his phone. Brian, I need you to call your bank immediately. Freeze any accounts Jessica has access to. Change all your passwords. We need to protect your assets before she tries to drain them. As Brian made the calls, I watched Jessica's family scramble. Patricia was screaming at the venue staff, demanding more time. Robert was on his phone with their lawyer, making threats about breach of contract. Brittany had disappeared entirely, probably looking for a ride home that wouldn't associate her with the disaster. Within 10 minutes, the venue staff began firmly escorting guests out. The flowers were being removed, the catering trucks pulling away. $85,000 worth of wedding disappearing like smoke. Jessica finally picked herself up from the pavement, her designer dress stained with asphalt mascara running down her face. She approached us one more time, but now Sam and Eddie stepped forward, flanking Brian protectively. These men, who'd helped raise him, who Jessica had deemed too blue-collar for her wedding, now stood as his guardians. This isn't over, Jessica hissed. I'll sue for breach of promise, emotional damage. You'll pay for humiliating me. Try it, Tom said calmly. I have enough evidence of fraud to have you arrested. Multiple counts across state lines, which makes it federal. Would you like me to call the FBI now, or would you prefer to leave quietly? The fight went out of Jessica then. She looked at Brian one last time, and for just a moment, I saw something almost like regret in her eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by the cold calculation I now knew was her true nature. You'll die alone, she spat at him. No woman will ever love you like I did. Thank God for that, Brian replied. As the Hawthorns retreated to their rental car, arguing loudly about who was to blame for the disaster, I put my hand on Brian's shoulder. Come on, son, let's go home. Which home? He asked bitterly. The house you bought for us. I can't go back there. No, I said. Your real home, where you grew up. Martha's making pot roast. For the first time in hours, Brian almost smiled. With the carrots and potatoes. Would it be pot roast without them? As we drove away from the wreckage of the wedding, Brian was quiet for a long time. Finally, he spoke. Dad, how did you know? How did you see through her, when I couldn't? Experience, I said simply. When you've built as many things as I have, you learn to spot unstable foundations. And son, you couldn't see it because you were in love. Love can blind us to a lot of things. I don't think I was really in love, Brian said quietly. I think I was in love with the idea of her, of being someone different, someone more sophisticated. I'm sorry I was ashamed of where I came from, Dad, of what you built. You weren't ashamed, I corrected. You were manipulated by someone who knew exactly which buttons to push. But you know what, you're free now. And that's all that matters. As we pulled into my driveway, the house Helen and I had built together, I saw Martha waiting on the porch. She'd changed out of her wedding outfit into jeans and one of her vintage concert t-shirts, looking like the aunt who'd helped raise Brian after his mother died. There's my nephew, she said, coming down the steps. You look like hell, kiddo. Feel like it too, Brian admitted, accepting her fierce hug. Good, Martha said. That means you're feeling something real for a change. Now get inside. We've got family dinner to make up for, and Sam and Eddie are already arguing about the game. Inside my house was full of the people Jessica had tried to exclude from the wedding. Construction workers, old family friends, the real community that had supported us through everything. They didn't ask questions, just welcomed Brian back with backslaps and beer, surrounding him with the genuine warmth that no amount of money could buy. As I watched my son slowly relax among his real family, I felt Helen's presence strongly. We'd protected our boy, even if it had taken longer than it should have. Later that evening, as things wound down, Brian found me on the back porch. Dad, what happens now? With Jessica, I mean. Will she really try to sue? Let her try, I said. Tom's got enough evidence to bury her. But honestly, I think she'll disappear, find another mark in another city. Her type always does. And the money you spent on the wedding? Money can be replaced, I said firmly. Sons can't. Brian was quiet for a moment. I need help, Dad. Therapy or something. To understand how I let this happen. How I almost lost everything that matters. We'll find you someone good, I promised. And Brian, this doesn't define you. How you recover from it will. As we sat there in comfortable silence, the sound of laughter drifting from inside the house, I realized that despite everything we'd lost, we'd gained something more valuable. We had our family back stronger for having been tested. The collapse of the wedding had been spectacular, but from the rubble, we were already beginning to rebuild. And this time, we'd make sure the foundation was solid. 6 months after the wedding that never was, I stood in the doorway of Morrison & Son Construction, watching Brian review blueprints with Eddie. My boy had traded his designer suits for work clothes, his soft hands for calloused ones, and the hollow sophistication Jessica had imposed for genuine competence. The transformation hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. The first weeks after the canceled wedding were the hardest. Brian had moved back home, sleeping in his childhood bedroom, while the legal untangling of his life with Jessica proceeded. She'd tried to fight at first, hiring a lawyer, with money she didn't have, making threats about lawsuits and public humiliation. But Tom Bradley was thorough. His evidence of her previous marriages and fraudulent schemes was overwhelming. When her ex-husband Marcus agreed to testify about her patterns, Jessica's lawyer advised her to walk away while she could. She disappeared one night, leaving town without a word. The last anyone heard, she'd moved to Phoenix, already working her way into another wealthy family's good graces. Her parents followed soon after, their Connecticut house finally foreclosed on their facade of wealth completely shattered. They left behind debts, angry creditors, and a community that now knew exactly who they really were. Brian threw himself into therapy with the determination of a man rebuilding from bedrock. Dr. Sarah Coleman specialized in victims of emotional manipulation, and she helped Brian understand how Jessica had systematically isolated and gaslit him. "It's like I was in a fog," Brian told me after one session. "Every decision I made seemed reasonable at the time, but looking back, I can see how she guided every choice, made me dependent on her approval." The therapy was just part of his rebuilding process. Brian had quit his marketing job, unable to face the colleagues who'd witnessed his transformation under Jessica's influence. Instead, he asked to join the family business. "Are you sure?" I'd asked. "This isn't your world anymore." "It was always my world," he'd replied. "I just forgot for a while." Starting at the bottom was humbling for a man with an MBA, but Brian never complained. He worked alongside the crews, learning the practical skills he'd missed while sitting in offices. Sam and Eddie took him under their wings, the same way they had when he was 10, teaching him not just construction, but the values of honest work and real friendship. The house I'd bought for Brian and Jessica was sold, the proceeds going into the trust fund I'd restructured with ironclad protections. Brian insisted on paying me back for the wedding costs from his own savings, though I tried to refuse. "I need to do this, Dad," he'd said. "I need to own my mistakes." 3 months into his construction education, Brian met Amy. She was a structural engineer, came to one of our job sites to consult on a load-bearing wall issue. No designer clothes, no perfectly styled hair, just competence and a quick wit that had the whole crew charmed within minutes. When she and Brian started discussing the mathematics of weight distribution, both getting excited about equations, I knew something had shifted. "She's different," Brian told me after their first date. "She pays for her own coffee, Dad. Insisted on it. And when I told her about Jessica, about how stupid I'd been, she said everyone has a past, and what matters is who we choose to become." Amy Richardson was everything Jessica hadn't been. Genuine, self-sufficient, and completely unimpressed by money or status. She drove a 10-year-old Honda, lived in a modest apartment, and spent her free time volunteering with Habitat for Humanity. When Brian brought her to family dinner, she jumped right in to help Martha in the kitchen, complimenting my sister's pot roast recipe and asking for cooking tips. "I like her," Martha told me privately. "She looks at Brian, not his bank account." Their relationship developed slowly, built on shared interests and mutual respect, rather than manipulation and grand gestures. Amy encouraged Brian's work with the construction company, even joining him on sites to better understand our projects. She had dinner with us every Sunday, becoming part of our family naturally, without force or pretense. A year after the disaster with Jessica, Brian had found his footing. He'd earned his contractor's license, was managing his own crew, and had developed a reputation for meticulous work. The soft marketing executive was gone, replaced by a man who understood the value of building something real. One evening, Brian found me in my office looking at old photos of Helen. "Mom would be proud of you," he said, sitting down across from me. "She'd be proud of you," I countered. "You found your way back." "I've been thinking about her a lot lately," Brian admitted. "About what she would have thought of Jessica, of how I acted. I think she would have been disappointed." "No," I said firmly. "She would have been worried, but never disappointed. Your mother understood that people make mistakes. What mattered to her was that they learned from them." Brian smiled, then pulled out a small velvet box. "I wanted to show you this before I showed Amy." Inside was a simple solitaire diamond ring, elegant but understated. "It's perfect," I told him. "I'm going to do it right this time," Brian said. "Long engagement, small wedding, only the people who matter. And Dad, I want you to be my best man." The proposal, when it came, was quintessentially Brian and Amy. He asked her at a Habitat build, both of them covered in drywall dust, surrounded by the community they served together. She said yes, immediately, then made him help her finish hanging the sheet before celebrating. The whole crew cheered Sam and Eddie, popping champagne they'd hidden in a cooler, just in case. Their wedding, 2 years after the Jessica disaster, was everything the first one hadn't been. Held in my backyard, the same place where Brian had grown up with only 50 guests. Amy wore her grandmother's dress, altered to fit perfectly. Brian stood at the altar in a simple suit, Tom Bradley beside him, as groomsman facing his bride with clear eyes and genuine love. Martha officiated, having gotten ordained online specifically for the occasion. Her ceremony was brief, but moving, talking about strong foundations and building a life together brick by brick. When she pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss was sweet and real, no performance or pretense. The reception was potluck style, everyone bringing something to share. Eddie's wife made her famous BBQ. Sam's family brought enough side dishes to feed an army, and Martha's 7-layer dip made another appearance. Amy had insisted on making her own wedding cake, a simple 3-tier creation that tasted infinitely better than any designer confection. As the evening wound down, I found myself once again on the back porch, but this time, Brian and Amy joined me, her wedding dress now sporting a few grass stains from dancing. "Thank you, Gerald," Amy said, surprising me with a hug. "For raising this man, for protecting him when he needed it, and for welcoming me into your family." "Thank you for bringing him home," I replied, meaning every word. Later, as I gave my best man speech, I looked out at the small gathering of genuine friends and family. 3 years ago, I almost lost my son, I began. Not to death, but to something maybe worse, losing himself. But real love, the kind built on truth and mutual respect, has a way of bringing us back to who we really are. Helen always told me that the strongest structures aren't the prettiest or the most expensive. They're the ones built on solid ground with quality materials. Brian and Amy, you've got both. Build something beautiful together. The applause was warm and genuine, so different from the polite clapping at that disaster of a rehearsal dinner. As Brian and Amy took the floor for their first dance, swaying to a simple song in the backyard where he'd learned to walk, I felt a presence beside me. Not Helen exactly, but the continuation of everything she'd believed in: family, genuine connection, hard work, and real love. We'd protected it, even when it nearly cost us everything. "Nice job, big brother," Martha said, appearing at my elbow with 2 beers. "Helen would be proud. Of Brian. Of both of you. You fought for him when he couldn't fight for himself. And he found his way back when most wouldn't have had the strength." As I watched my son dance with his wife surrounded by people who loved them for who they were, rather than what they had, I realized the truth in Martha's words. The wedding that had cost $85,000 had collapsed in spectacular fashion, but from its ashes had come something infinitely more valuable. Brian caught my eye over Amy's shoulder and mouthed, "Thank you." I raised my beer in salute, thinking of all we'd been through to reach this moment. Jessica had been wrong about one thing. She'd said Brian would die alone, that no woman would love him like she had. But she'd been measuring love by the wrong standard. Real love didn't isolate or manipulate. It didn't demand the erasure of family or the abandonment of values. Real love built up rather than tore down. As the stars came out over Kansas City, shining down on a simple backyard wedding, I knew we'd won more than just a battle against a con artist. We'd won back our family stronger and wiser than before. The story of Brian's first wedding would always be there, a cautionary tale about the dangers of losing yourself in the wrong person. But it wasn't the ending. It was just a chapter in a longer story, one that Helen had started and that would continue through Brian and Amy's children, through the business we'd build together, through the values we'd pass on. That night, after all the guests had gone home and Brian and Amy had left for their honeymoon, a simple road trip to the mountains with no luxury resorts or designer experiences, I sat alone in my kitchen. The same kitchen Jessica had mocked, where Helen had cooked thousands of meals, where Brian had done his homework and learned about life. I pulled out a photo from my wallet, one of Helen I'd carried for decades. "We did it, honey," I whispered. "We got our boy back." The house was quiet, but it wasn't empty. It was full of memories, good and bad, that had shaped us into who we were. Tomorrow, I'd go back to work, building structures that would last. Brian would be back in a week, ready to take on more responsibility in the company that would one day be his. Amy would be there too, bringing her expertise and warmth to our family business. But tonight, I just sat with the satisfaction of a father who'd fought for his son and won. Not with fists or anger, but with patient strategy and the unshakable belief that truth and genuine love would ultimately prevail. The wedding disaster that had started with Jessica screaming for me to leave had ended with a family united, a son redeemed, and a future bright with honest possibility. Sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as the worst disasters. We just need the wisdom to see them through to the end. As I finally headed to bed, I thought about the lessons learned. Trust once broken could be rebuilt. Family once fractured could heal. And love, real love based on truth and mutual respect, was worth more than all the designer dresses and country club memberships in the world. Brian and Amy understood that now. And someday, when they faced their own challenges, they'd have the strength that came from surviving the worst and choosing to build something better. That was Helen's true legacy, lived out in the son we'd raised and the family we'd protected. And that was worth every penny of the $85,000 I'd lost, and infinitely more. If you've made it this far, you've witnessed the power of trusting your instincts and protecting those you love, even when they can't see the danger themselves. Gerald's story reminds us that real wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the strength of our relationships and the values we refuse to compromise. Have you ever had to make a difficult choice to protect someone you love, even when they couldn't understand your actions at the time? What would you have done in Gerald's position? I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please consider giving it a like and sharing it with others who might need to hear its message. Don't forget to subscribe to hear more stories about families who faced impossible odds and emerged stronger on the other side. Thank you for joining me on this journey. May you always have the wisdom to recognize genuine love and the courage to fight for it, just as Gerald fought for Brian. Until next time, remember the strongest foundations aren't always the prettiest, but they're the ones that stand the test of time.